Hello and welcome to Season 5, Episode 6 of Conservation Conversations with BirdLife South Africa. I'm your host, Andrew de Blok, coming to you live from Johannesburg. Now, we have over 150 episodes recorded and available on YouTube, so if you miss out for whatever reason, you can always catch up later by just looking up BirdLife South Africa. So tonight, as I mentioned, we have Ben Murphy joining us. He is representing the FitzPatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town. However, Ben is actually joining us from Utah. Ben completed his biology honours at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland and his master's in conservation at the University of Exeter. Ben started his Ph.D. at the University of Cape Town in 2018 under the supervision of Associate Prof. Susie Cunningham and Dr. Tom Flower within the Hot Birds Research Project. So on our last Conservation Conversations episode, we were exposed to the truth around the threat of climate change in South Africa and globally. And Ben's work is about to put that into very clear focus for birds. He's been evaluating how parental fork-tailed Drongos mitigate the costs of breeding at hot temperatures in the Kalahari. Ben has also worked on 3 film productions of Drongo behavior, and if we ask nicely, he might show us some of the proceeds of that later, in conjunction with Meerkats, the first of which was released in 2021 on Disney+. Currently, Ben's evaluating how to improve reproductive success of southern yellow-billed hornbills in the Kalahari through insulated nest boxes. So Ben is clearly a very interesting guy, a man of the world, and a man of the people. So he's going to present to us tonight. So Ben, I'm going to introduce you, or invite you rather, to unmute yourself, turn on your video, and when you are ready, to take it away. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, cheers introduction. Let's get started. Well, thanks for having me. My name is Ben Murphy. I'm a PhD student at the FitzPatrick, finishing my PhD in the next 1.5 to 2 months. So I'm going to talk to you guys today a little bit about compensation for missed opportunity costs at high temperatures in the fork-tailed Drongo in particular. Now, anthropogenic climate change is altering environmental conditions globally and will impact biodiversity as air temperatures increase. But it's important to remember that environmental temperature increases will vary dependent on locality. Now, the arid zone is a great place to study the effects of these warming air temperatures because it's predicted to undergo the most rapid increase in temperature in the coming decade. When we look at some data from a weather station in the Kalahari, we can see the number of days with an air temperature greater than 40 degrees Celsius, here on the y-axis, have increased dramatically in number over the last few years, and are predicted to increase a lot more. Now, the arid zone is characterized by hot air temperatures and unpredictable food and water availability. This means there'll be inherently high stress load on individuals due to the greater resource cost of activity and survival. And it raises the question of how individuals that are already at their physical tolerance levels will be able to persist in these environments as air temperatures increase further. Now, the one way that individuals actually can overcome warm temperatures is by thermoregulation. So here we have a fork-tailed Drongo, clearly panting with the beak wide open. What it's doing there is it's using the water inside its body to cool its body temperature. But as I said previously, water is quite a scarce resource in the Kalahari. So this water cost of thermoregulation, this physiological cost, is very, very high. And animals can actually reduce these costs by doing behavioral thermoregulation. Now, these behavioral adjustments are things such as shade seeking. So, for example, when it's very, very hot, the bird can reduce its activity, thereby reducing its exposure and therefore needing to cool less, so it loses less water. But as you can probably imagine, investment into these behavioral adjustments comes with a consequence. It precludes you from investing into other behaviors. And this leads to missed opportunities. So, for example, the Drongo here on the bottom left is foraging in the sunlight, but it can't at the same time be seeking refuge in the shade. So we have this trade-off between activity and behavioral thermoregulation. And these trade-offs are likely to get much, much steeper during breeding because of the additional resource needs of offspring. You know, the offspring need to be fed, so parents might be forced to undertake more activity at hot times than they would potentially like to. And birds are a great species to study these trade-offs because they have very limited water and fat storage, so these trade-offs are going to be even steeper. And I just want to kind of briefly introduce some of the work that's been done on 2 other species. The bottom left, we have the southern yellow-billed hornbill, and the bottom right, we have the southern-pied babbler. And observational work on both of these species showed that as air temperatures increased here on the x-axis for both of these graphs, both species actually reduced their ability to forage. Hornbills captured fewer prey items in the 30-minute focal as air temperatures increased, and babblers were actually less efficient at foraging. And this was correlated to an increased investment into thermoregulation. Here we can see on the left that as air temperature increased, hornbills spent a greater portion of time panting, cooling themselves with water. And in babblers, in fact, as air temperatures increased, they spent a greater portion of time heat dissipating. So we see a pretty clear behavioral adjustments due to air temperatures and trade-off between activity and thermoregulation. But it gets worse because these trade-offs will also impact your ability to undertake parental care. When Tanya van der Veen, who's a previous PhD at the Fitz, and then Wiley and Ridley looked at babblers, Tanya saw that as air temperatures increased, there was a significant decrease in the daily provisioning rate in hornbills. You can see here both lines for males and females decreasing significantly on the left graph. On the right graph, we see that as air temperatures increased, babblers were actually provisioning a lower proportion of food to their offspring. And this had really quantifiable benefits for offspring development. We see that here on the left, as air temperatures increased, hornbills were actually, hornbill chicks, I should say, were actually fledging in a much lower mass as this air temperature increased. And in babblers, the kind of pre-fledging morphometrics they were taking, this day 11 nestling weight, was significantly decreasing as the portion of days above a critical temperature increased. So we're seeing some serious impacts of air temperatures with quantifiable fitness consequences in these two species. And this leads me on to the fork-tailed drongo. So in 2017, a master student at the Fitz, this is part of the CB program, Ryan Ollinger, he actually did feeding experiments with fork-tailed drongos at the hottest part of the day. And the reason he did feeding experiments is because both these other works were observational, and the feeding experiment allowed him to standardize prey availability. And here, with air temperature represented as T-air, he saw that as the mean air temperature during these feeding experiments increased, there was a significant increase in the likelihood of drongos both wing drooping and panting, thermoregulating. And he then also looked at the foraging activity, and he saw that there was a decreased willingness to forage in feeding experiments as air temperature increased, here with the x-axis having mean air temperature and the y-axis having the proportion of worms refused. Drongos were refusing to fly for a greater number of worms as these trial temperatures got hotter. So we saw a similar trend as what was reported in the hornbills and the babblers, despite, having standardized prey availability. So both species, all these species are basically having trade-offs between activity and thermoregulation. He took it one step further and looked at the provisioning activity at these high air temperatures, and he presumed, based on what had been seen in the hornbills and the babblers, that he'd see a similar trend. And in fact, as the mean air temperature here on the x-axis increased, drongos were provisioning a lower proportion of mealworms. You can see the nice kind of line going down, decreasing. And therefore, he expected to see this kind of quantifiable consequence for offspring. But here's the crazy thing. So Ryan's drongos didn't show any effective air temperature. The chicks' kind of pre-fledged mass was completely stable, irrespective of air temperature during the nesting period, which was nuts. This is the first species that we'd studied that showed, behavioral alterations due to higher temperatures and reduced parental activity, but no fitness consequences in offspring. And it raised the question of how drongos might be mitigating the costs of breeding in these hot environments. And we as a group have kind of hypothesized that drongos are reducing these costs by using behavioral mitigation. Now, for the sake of this talk, I would like to focus on one aspect of my research, which leads nicely into the next one, which is looking at whether drongos are actually able to compensate for reduced activity at this hottest part of the day by increasing their activity in cooler morning or evening periods, kind of to compensate for this reduction. And while Ryan looked at just the hottest part of the day, we're taking it a step further by running these experiments at morning and evening, these cooler periods. Now, this is obviously, very lifelike. This is what it looks like in the Kalahari. We have our feeding experimental template. Basically, what's really cool with the system we work with is that we have habituated drongos to a summoning call, if you would, which goes something like this. The drongo hears that call and will fly over to us for a food reward. This is great because it allows us to standardize aspects of our feeding experiment. For example, we can summon the drongo at a set tree, at a set distance from the nest. We can call the drongo to a particular perch, so the initial microclimate, shade or sun, is standardized. And we've been running these feeding experiments at morning, midday, and evening, where we'd basically provide the Drongos with 20 worms, one each 40 seconds during each of these time periods. And we'd throw the worm up in such a way to standardize the flight distance of the Drongo. The worm would go up, Drongo would come out, grab the mealworm, and return to its perch. And the observer then notes down whether the worm was eaten by the Drongo, whether it was provisioned to offspring, or whether the Drongo simply ignored this worm. And we ran some pretty complicated mixed effect models looking at foraging activity and provision decisions from these, where we controlled for things like chick age or brood size. And we ran these experiments over 2 to 3 years. Now, I've shown this schematic to many people over the years, so I thought it would spice things up a little bit and actually show you guys what it looks like in the Kalahari. So here we have an observer who will throw the worm to the Drongo. And the worm is thrown at a set distance from the Drongo, which allows the Drongo to fly out. In this case, Drongo flies to grab the worm. In this case, consumes the worm and returns to its perch. And we've been running these for multiple years across hotter and cooler days to really kind of explore these behavioral alterations. We then also looked at fitness consequences. So we weighed chicks on day 12 post-hatch. For us, that's the pre-fledgling kind of boundary, if you would call, where we take our mass measurements and our tarsus measurements. The reason we do this on day 12 post-hatch is we've noticed that anything over day 13 or 14, they start to get a bit jumpy. And we really want to avoid force fledging any of these chicks. So to grab these chicks, we basically have to scale these incredibly tall trees, which range from about 6 to about 9.5 meters. So in this instance, on the left image, I have climbed the tree with very good support from my assistant, and I'm able to grab the chicks and I'm able to come back down. And then we place the chicks on the scale on the right. We've actually developed a patented chick retention system, as you can see being deployed here, which allows us to immobilize the chick and get an accurate weight. And in this case, the chicks got 40.1 grams, which is quite heavy. Drongo chicks are usually between the low 20s and sometimes the low 40s. We then also get tarsus measurements, where we basically measure the actual length of the tarsus, the foot. So coming on to some of my results. First things first, looking at foraging during our experiments, we saw that at midday, we saw a significant kind of decrease in the proportion of worms caught as air temperatures increased, here with the top graph. And the second graph looked at the likelihood of panting, and we saw a significant increase in the likelihood of panting during these midday feeding experiments. Now, this is firstly quite cool because it shows that what Ryan saw, we've also been able to replicate, and we have this reduction of activity at hot temperatures at the hottest time of day. But it's also comparable to the previous work seen by the hornbills and the babblers. When we looked at the morning periods, we saw there was no effect of air temperature on either the proportion of mealworms caught during an experiment or the likelihood of panting. However, in the evening, we saw there was no effect of the air temperature on the proportion of mealworms caught, but the increased likelihood of panting did exist in the evening feeding experiments. And this is likely because if we look at the actual x-axis in the bottom right graph, we can see that some of these feeding experiments are still at very, very hot temperatures. So Drongos are still undertaking or constrained by thermonuclear costs in these instances. Then we looked at provision decisions, and we looked at the total number of mealworms provisioned and the proportion provisioned. Again, starting with midday, with the x-axis representing the maximum air temperature during an experiment, we saw that the total number of mealworms provisioned decreased significantly as these midday experiments got hotter. But there was no effect of air temperature in the midday on proportion provisioned. And then we got to a really interesting finding. We saw that in the mornings, Drongos were actually increasing the total numbers of mealworms provisioned and the proportion. So Drongos were actively allocating more worms to chicks on hotter mornings on hot days. In the evening, we saw no effect of air temperatures on the total provisioned or the proportion provisioned. And this made us think a little bit. We might have evidence for compensation here if the morning increases are enough to offset the reduction at midday. So we looked at this at a daily scale. And basically, here you have your x-axis with your maximum daily air temperature and your y-axis being the daily total number of mealworms actually provisioned. We can see that, yes, Drongos seem to mitigate for that, or compensate, I should say, for that reduction midday by this morning activity because the line's quite flat. However, I want you to note that Drongos weren't increasing the number of mealworms provisioned as days got hotter. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind for later. We're looking at the rest of the nesting consequences here with our pre-fledgling day 12, the left graph having chick mass at day 12, and the right graph having chick tarsus at day 12. We see no effect of the average maximum temperature during the nest cycle. The reason this is quite cool is because, again, Drongos are still conquering the Kalahari. They're still seeming to produce these chicks with no fitness consequences. And it's the same trend as what Ryan saw. Now, Ryan saw that in 1 year. This is 4 seasons worth of chicks. So that trend is alive and well in the Kalahari. And that's really, really good. So in summary, we don't really have any evidence for compensatory foraging. But we seem to have this compensatory provisioning happening in the morning, and it seems to be enough to actually overcome the decreased provisioning in midday. So Drongos seemingly know when the day is going to get hot and are able to buffer the chicks against this upcoming period. But there is a little bit of a concern, because if air temperatures increase as they're projected to, then mornings out of this traditional cooler period are likely to get shorter in terms of their actual cool period. So Drongos might not be able to compensate sufficiently if these cool mornings become a shorter and shorter time period. And we know by looking at the midday and some of the evening that when it's hot, Drongos are paying thermoregulatory costs. So if they start having to pay those costs in the morning, then we may start to see that trade-off slant more towards adult survival and Drongos be unable to sufficiently buffer their chicks. But there's more going on. So we put up some camera traps at our nests to capture provisioning events during the day. And these camera traps were infrared. And we noticed that Drongos were actually feeding their offspring in twilight periods, pre-dawn or post-dusk, here in the bottom right at 5:14. And it got us thinking that maybe our experiments were missing early or very late activity. Could Drongos be compensating for very hot days by increasing their activity during these twilight periods? And this is something we're currently exploring quite a lot. However, there may be a hidden cost to this twilight compensatory activity. If you're active during these periods, you might actually reveal your nest location to other nocturnal predators. In this case, roughly an hour after Drongos had, half an hour after they provisioned their nest, we captured this event. I apologize for the stuttiness. The genet did not want to stay in focus, but we had this happen to us. So the genet actually found the nest and ate all the chicks. And we have a few other videos of owls and things, and we're trying to explore whether potentially there is actually this hidden cost, this constraint to twilight activity by this increased predation pressure. But there's more. So when you think about it, when it's a very, very hot day, the chicks are going to be really, really thirsty, and they're going to need more water. The only water chicks get during the day will actually be from the food they're provided. But we know, based on the daily totals, that Drongos weren't increasing those totals as days got hotter on the daily scale. But we also know that chick growth is sustained. So what could be going on? And we think that compensatory provisioning is actually only part of the message. And Drongos in the hottest part of the day will actually shade their chicks from the sunlight. So here, for example, on 3 o'clock, which is close to the hottest part of the day, Drongo is perched above its chicks with its wings well spread, protecting the chicks from the sunlight. And we wanted to explore this aspect quite a bit more, this parental shading behavior. But the first thing is, what is shading behavior and what's the purpose? So we think that parental shading might actually be there to mitigate offspring's costs. And by costs, I mean thermoregulatory costs. We already said that chicks have limited water available to them and their water needs will increase. But if the parents are able to actually provide an environment where chicks' thermoregulatory costs are lower, they can invest more of that water energy into growth rather than thermoregulation. And we think that parents might be shielding chicks from the solar radiation during these shading bouts, which could have a quantifiable benefit of actually reducing the nest temperature. So a cooler nest temperature or a cooler nest environment could allow chicks to invest, as I said, more resources into growth. To explain these concepts a little bit more, I've designed a few things. So here we have a nest in the morning. The nest is right in the middle, and the blue circle around the nest indicates the nest temperature. It's nice and cool in the morning. Here to the right, we have nest TE, which is the environmental temperature, and further to the right, we have T-air, the air temperature. So in the morning, everything's nice and dandy. But as the day progresses and T-air increases, we'll also get an increased solar radiation from the sun as we trend towards midday. This increased solar radiation, if unblocked, will actually lead to the nest getting really, really hot. And we have on record that some nests can even reach 60 degrees Celsius. Now, that's a pretty hot environment for your chicks to survive in. And if we're talking about limited resource environments, such as the Kalahari, that's a lot of resources that chicks are using on their own thermoregulation rather than their growth and survival. So if parents could come along and somehow block the solar radiation and keep this nest temperature nice and low, we might see some real benefits. And this is what happens when you don't actually shade your chick well enough. So this is a little bit distressing. So a little word of warning, this chick is exceptionally heat stressed. And as you can see, there's no shade in the nest. The parents haven't shaded them. It is panting a lot. It's moving around a lot. It's looking for a cooler microclimate. And in fact, in the bottom left, you can see the camera trap is recording at 63 degrees Celsius. So clearly, parents need to be somehow mitigating this to allow their offspring to survive. Luckily, before all of you get worried, this chick actually was fine. Didn't show any long-term consequences of being exposed to this brutally hot day. So to collect this data, we've kind of partitioned it two. The first thing we did is we've been basically installing infrared camera traps on our nests for the last 6 years. And what we've been trying to do is to capture activity at the nest, mainly shading bouts, so that we can look at stuff like how long did they shade in relation to air temperature, bout characteristics such as the number of bouts or the average length, or even time between bouts, and relate that all to air temperature. We've also then coupled that data with eye button data. Now, an eye button is basically a small temperature logger that what we've done is we've been able to weave them into the side wall of the nest in such a way that it doesn't actually touch the chicks, but can log the temperature of the nest. And through these camera traps and these eye buttons, we are able to kind of tackle or start to look at what might be happening with shading and what the effects might be. So moving on to some results. Oh, sorry, I've jumped the gun there. The one thing that really stumped us, actually, when we started this analysis was which chick age to use. Now, I chuckle because initially we took all of the chicks and we lumped them all together and we had a look at shading. And we saw no effect of anything. And we were very confused as to what was going on until we realized that basically the younger chicks were always being shaded more. And that young chick was eating up all of the effects of all of our predictors. So what we had to do is we had to actually remove those younger chicks from our analysis. Now, we think younger chicks are actually being shaded more because they haven't actually developed endothermia at their young age. And we're talking about anything from day 0 to day 3 post-hatch, very, very young chicks. And they're basically ectotherms at this point. So the parents have to be continuously shading because they have to keep that nest environment as cool as possible. So then we decided, all right, let's focus on nests with chicks that are day 7 or day 8 post-hatch old, because we're starting to see an effect of air temperature on these chicks and on this environment. We also thought about maybe using some of our older chicks, anything above day 10, but it's very hard to figure out what's going on when they're that big. So we had to just kind of let that go and just focus on those middle chicks. Because you can see when the chicks are this big, the nest is almost compromised as well. So looking at some results very, very easily with the air temperature here, T-air, during our recording period, which was from 11 until 3:30 on the x-axis, and the proportion of time spent shading, we saw that Drongos were increasing the amount of time they spent shading as air temperature increased, which made sense. Then we looked at shading bout characteristics, and we looked at the average bout length, and we looked at the time between bouts. And we noticed that firstly, here with the mean air temperature during the recording on the x-axis and the logged base 10 of the mean bout time, your average bout length basically on the y-axis, there was no effect of temperature. Drongos had a very standardized bout length that wasn't being affected. When we looked at the time between bouts, or recess, we saw that as air temperature increased, there was a significant decrease. Drongos were taking shorter breaks. They weren't adjusting the amount of time they spent shading per bout, but they were taking shorter breaks as air temperature increased. You can see that here quite clearly with the decreasing line. And that's quite interesting because it implies that there potentially there's a limit to how long you can shade for. And it kind of opens a can of worms into what might be constraining your ability to shade. But also, if you have to take these breaks because you have to offload temperature, and you just have to take shorter break because you can't increase your time spent shading, well, then you've got a really big conundrum between your own survival and chick survival. And then we had a look at some of the actual effects of parent presence. Now, bear with me, but basically what you have to do to look at the effects of shading is you have to understand, firstly, with two nests, we have a nest with chicks and a nest without chicks, right, as a comparison. But we need to make sure that the climate conditions or air temperature conditions are basically the same for both of these nests, because we want to look at the effect of a parent presence on the nest versus when it's not there. And we can see here on the left graph with the mean daily maximum temperature on the y-axis and the nests with chicks and nests with no chicks, that the air conditions were similar for both of these. So that was good because the climatic conditions were similar as well, such as solar radiation and wind. So we can compare these two kind of like different types of nests. And when we looked at nests that had actual chicks and parents, here on the right graph on the chicks and the versus nests with no chicks, we actually saw that parent presence seemed to significantly have lower or cooler nest environmental temperatures compared to no chick nests. And that raised the question of, well, maybe parents shading are actually able to reduce this this environmental temperature, and that's how they're doing it. But then we had a little thought. We were like, well, we haven't actually accounted for one of the critical components, which be what might chicks be doing? What is chick presence doing to this nest temperature? So we then took every single bout that had ever happened, a shading bout, I should say, during our day 7, day 8 recording periods. And we broke them, we kind of classified each bout into two categories, one or the other. So whether during this bout the parent was on the nest and shading, or whether the parent was off the nest. And then we thought that as air temperature increased here in the middle, we'd expect that bouts where parents were off the nest would probably have a greater increase in nest environmental temperature, here indicated by the orange arrow, whereas bouts with parents on the nest would probably have a slower increase in nest environmental temperature as air temperature increased. And we'd see these lovely slopes where we'd have almost, you imagine, a line with the parent off nest really increasing dramatically, whereas the parent on the nest bouts kind of really hugging as close to air temperature as possible to provide that benefit. And we're thinking, there we go, that's how we can quantify this benefit of shading. Didn't really go to plan, unfortunately. So you'll notice firstly on this graph with daily maximum temperature on the x-axis and environmental temperature on the y-axis, that there aren't two lines, there's only one. And this is basically because although we compare these on and off nest bouts, there was no obvious difference. We're a little stumped by this. We think it may have to do with maybe the eye buttons we've used, we lack the sensitivity. There could be that some chicks are in contact with the eye buttons, which is influencing temperature. And it could also be that the way parents are shading, because drongos can either basically fully sit on chicks or stand on them. And this might be some of the inaccuracies. But one thing I want to draw to your attention is, if you notice, there's a nice solid black line here, which is basically the ratio, the one-to-one ratio between Tmax and nest TE. And you'll notice that basically, if you were a drongo, you want to try and keep your nest environmental temperature as close as possible to T-air, so that for your chicks, that increase, when it's very, very hot, in the nest, it's not as hot as it could be. It's a little bit hotter, so you can ensure. And we can see at the top right of this graph that as air temperature increases on the x-axis, the nest environmental temperature, regardless of parent presence or just chicks, is trending towards that air temperature. So we seem to have evidence of somehow drongos being able to down-regulate this nest environmental temperature. And that's nuts. That's really, really cool. I mean, they're almost getting close to air temperature. And that could explain something of what's going on and how drongos might be mitigating these offspring thermoregulatory costs. So in conclusion, we've done quite a lot of stuff now. And we've talked about activity patterns when we've talked about shading. But what if we take it all? Well, if we take it all together and we think back to the fact that there are no consequences of air temperature on chick mass, we could argue that drongos are successfully compensating by doing lots of small behavioral adjustments to their activity patterns in the face of air temperature, which allows them to sustain this chick growth. Doing the quick bullet fire round, we see that morning provisioning compensates for midday. but we know that there's increasing water costs for chicks on hot days. So there should be a dehydration risk for these chicks. But if we look at the actual chick morphometrics, there's no decrease in chick mass. They appear fine. So the water going into chicks is probably enough. So how would they be managing? Well, if we then combine the actual shading behavior, we know that drongos are increasing their shading in the hot parts of the day with increasing air temperature. And it appears to be overall that shading or parental attendance is actually reducing our environmental temperatures. But we need to remember that the average bout length was fixed, wasn't increasing with increasing air temperature, and appears constrained. But the time between bouts was decreasing with air temperature. So parents might be limited by their ability to offload heat. The drongos are shading the nests and potentially allowing or storing this heat in their dark feathers. And there's some research that seems to indicate that the birds or dark feathered birds can actually kind of offload this heat by flying through the air column, either up or down. They fly through a different thermal gradient and offload all of this heat. So could it be actually that the average shading bouts are limited by the fact that drongos reach a point where their feathers are getting so hot, temperatures actually coming through to their skin, and at that point they leave? But now we need to understand a little bit more about this time between the shading bouts. How are drongos offloading this heat so successfully? Are they drinking water? What are they doing in between shading bouts? And that's some of the stuff that we're hoping to explore in the future, to look at whether drongos are using water use or whether they're doing something particularly cool, like flying a lot to really offload this heat. And there's some evidence that suggests that if you have a warm feather wing, you're actually more efficient at flight. And that's one of the things that we're kind of really delving into, is looking at the costs of flight. Because overall, drongos show no real effect of air temperature still on their offspring. And with that bombshell, I would very much like to thank the people who have made all of this work possible, particularly my supervisors, the top two, Susan Cunningham, Tom Flower, and my assistants, Oberking Pule and Samantha Wagstaff, who've helped through multiple years of this work and have been absolute rocks in our field. And if you've not had enough of the Fork-tailed Drongo just yet, please feel free to check out our newest episode on Disney Plus on the series called Supernatural, where we look at how drongos are using false alarm calls to dupe meerkats. We've also got 2 more film productions that are coming out in the next 2 years about various aspects of drongo behavior. And we hope that you guys get as excited about them as we are. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Ben. I think we'll let this just play in the background while we chat. But yeah, phenomenal presentation. It's always a privilege for me to have other representatives of the Fitz on. Of course, I'm an alumni of that fantastic organization or institution as well. So it's great to see the quality of science has probably gone up since I left, but that just might be a factor of my leaving rather than anything else. Fantastic presentation. Thanks very much. Exciting work that you're doing, and good luck with the final push for that PhD.
Thanks.
All right. So we do have some questions in the background. I'm going to take on some of them now. Helen's got a question, just very simply. Do drongos not choose nesting sites that just have more shade and therefore might be a bit cooler?
Oh, great question. So we're looking at this as well at the moment. We've noticed that drongos will often reuse previous nesting sites from previous years. So what we've been trying to do is to quantify kind of the natural coverage that you might get, so vegetation coverage. But what's weird is that sometimes drongos will just nest in a very dead tree that's completely open. So we're not quite sure whether they have preferential nest sites, but we think they might do, but it might be constrained by predation pressure. And we noticed that at nests where they fail, they tend to use those sites again, but 2 or 3 years down the road. So there's obviously some long-term thinking going on. But yeah, it would be great to look at that. I think it is happening, and I think it's being curtailed by predation pressure.
Yeah, very interesting. There's a question from Irene Rose, who asks, what criteria did you use when choosing the 2 species? So referring to The Drongos, obviously, which you spoke about today, but also the hornbills that you're working on.
Oof. So I don't know if I should shoot the shot too much. I think there's a talk coming about the hornbills later this year, so I'll try and be brief. But the hornbills are really struggling in the Kalahari, especially the population that we've been monitoring is predicted to go extinct in the Kalahari in the next 40 years. So we noticed this about 12 years ago that they had very poor reproductive success. And so a lot of the effort was being invested into understanding what was going on then. And then while we're doing this work, we had an idea of, well, what's happening with the fly catching species? Because obviously hornbills and babblers are ground foraging species, we'd say, but a Drongo or American flycatcher forages in a completely different environment. So we're wondering, what are we seeing a similar kind of a consequence there? And that's kind of what led us to choose these different species.
Interesting. Yeah, thank you. A couple of questions from Rob Simmons, who you may know from FitzLinks. So Rob, his first question, I'll just ask them both if you don't mind. And the first is there a threshold temperature at which Kalahari Drongos will be forced from this hot desert environment? Because you do seem to indicate that they're coping okay at the moment. And then his second question is there any evidence that Drongos are switching breeding seasons, perhaps, to avoid extreme heat in the summer season?
Good questions. So I'll answer them in reverse order. Firstly, no, we have no evidence for Drongos shifting their breeding. They breed reliably regardless of what's going on. They'll always start around October and they finish around January or February. The only real adjustment I've seen is we had a very, very wet year in 2020. Astronomical amounts of rainfall. The river that hadn't flowed in 40 years actually flowed again. And the Drongos bred for longer that year, but they didn't necessarily start earlier. And then the first question was the thermal threshold. Well, that's a really good question. We know that in hornbills, when they're breeding the boxes, their thermal tolerance is 50.6 degrees Celsius, at which point they basically just stop breeding. But for Drongos, we haven't actually found one yet. So there's a lot of work done by UP looking at physiology. But unfortunately, the Drongos seem to be breaking the physiology equipment. And so the stress hormone profiles and a lot of the metabolic heat rate hasn't quite come together yet. We think that might be because Drongos are stress generalists. So they're quite capable of navigating this hot landscape. I don't necessarily think they're going to be driven out of the Kalahari anytime soon, especially because when Drongos get really heat stressed, they drink water from those available little water troughs. You know, all the farmers around the Kalahari have those water troughs for their cattle or for their sheep, and Drongos will make use of that. One of my pages chapters has actually shown that water is the constraining resource for Drongos, and that they will, you know, shift to try and find it if needs be. I mean, we've had a few times where they've just bailed out of experiments to go and drink on a 42-degree day. So, you know, that would be something to look at for sure.
For sure. A question from Nikki Forbes. So she firstly asked around the seasonality of the breeding, which you've answered already. But then did you look at whether prey availability changed with temperature?
Oh, so this is why we ran feeding experiments with the standardized prey availability, which was to remove this. We did actually run focals, which are basically when you follow the bird naturally. We have in our population, we've kind of got two subsections. We've got one that's well habituated to our presence. We can stay within 5 meters of them, and we run feeding experiments with them. The other is kind of a more wild, and we use them to get natural behaviors. So in those situations where prey availability isn't standardized, but we see the same trends in the focal data as we do for the experimental data.
All right, interesting. And then William's asking something which I actually wondered myself is, have you considered the temperature effect in the nests of the chicks themselves? They're generating body heat.
Yes, so this is something that I'm a little bit perturbed by, because I had hoped that the on and off bout analysis would magically show us these wonderful curves. And the metabolic heat production by chicks is absolutely something we need to look at. And it's something we need to look at pretty quickly. We haven't looked at it yet. I suspect that the approach might be to use different temperature probes and potentially use them as an array across the nest. But we have to remember that these nests are about, you know, yay big. So it's very hard to shove a lot of different things into them. I would love to look at that. I do believe that the convoluted nest environmental temperature effects we're seeing is as a result of tick metabolic heat production, the actual shading effect of parents. I mean, parents will also produce heat as well. Temperature effects we're seeing is as a result of shading effect of parents. I mean, parents will also produce heat as well. Convoluted nest environmental temperature. Sorry, I can hear myself and repeat for some reason.
Yeah, sorry. No, carry on.
But yeah, I would love to look at that. I think there's a lot going on, and we need to get our handle on the resting metabolic heat, heart rate stuff for Drongos for adults first. Be also quite cool to look at whether the surface of the nest, that temperature profile, you know, those fancy thermal cameras you can get that can basically tell you what the surface temperature looks like. Be quite interesting to look at. Maybe that's a nice way to get at the changing temperature of the nest rather than trying to put these eye buttons inside them.
Yeah, just so much to know. And the more you scratch under the surface, the more you realize that it is that we don't know about the natural world.
This
And
is the problem.
yeah, and the problem in climate change instances is that it's urgent. So we need to find out to know how to react, coming from BirdLife South Africa's perspective as a conservation organization. Question from Sarah Ward. I'll just read it verbatim. Have you analyzed the temperature variability and Drongo behavior in the context of the relative dominance of the heat budget terms, radiative versus sensible versus latent? That's a bit too clever for me. I don't know if you can understand that.
We haven't yet, actually. That would be a good thing to look at. That would be a good thing to look at. It's a good idea. Thank you. And we'll actually, yeah, we'll do that.
Awesome. Cool. And then there was a last question from Helen, I think, feeling a little bad for the hornbills in the Kalahari going extinct, saying perhaps we could translocate some from Kruger, but I think those birds come from quite a different ecology, no?
Yes. I mean, the Kruger birds have got a whole different, they've got to do with humidity, which is not something we've looked at as such in the Kalahari. It's not as much of a factor we think, but there is some evidence that potentially very, very humid days might actually be overwhelming birds' normal responses, because obviously when it's really humid, you can't even use panting to cool yourself down because there's so much water in the air that you've lost that ability to lose your heat. So, you know, there's been a lot done at KZN, reports of mass bird die-offs in KZN due to high humidity days with a not particularly high temperature. I mean, talk about translocating. I'm pretty sure if you move Drongos into Spain or Italy, they'd smash it because they're very good generalists. People say that Drongos are insectivorous, but I've seen them catch gerbils and catch snakes, and you know they could probably go anywhere really. And I think they've been spreading a little bit. I mean, I remember when I first came to Cape Town, there were none at UCT, and now there are 4 breeding pairs. So, completely anecdotally, I get the impression that they're doing quite well at the moment.
Yeah, they do seem to be doing well. One of those weird species which, yeah, may just take an advantage from warming temperatures by being able to deal with it better than others, I guess. What on earth is a Drongo doing with a gerbil once it's caught?
Eating it.
How?
I mean, I'll try to be non-graphic. Basically, it opened a certain area in the skull and proceeded to eat the gerbil's brains.
Okay.
We were filming for a BBC production, and I spotted the Drongo just nail the gerbil on the ground, and we got some pretty good footage of it. But it was not something you expect to see. But we know that often species, when they're stressed or when the food is scarce, they tend to use different or available food sources to supplement the diet. So maybe it's that. Maybe it's more of a sudden facultative decision. I don't know.
Well, we'll look out for the zombie Drongo movie coming out soon, filmed by the BBC. All right. That is all the questions I have for you, Ben. So all that is left to say is just thank you very, very much for your time. Congratulations on getting this far, and good luck with the last push. We're all rooting for you, and we look forward to seeing some publications in the future, and your future work as well. So we'll gladly have you back once you have some hornbill data to share.
Oh, yes. Absolutely watch the space. It's going to be great.
Awesome. Thank you, Ben.
Cheers.
And thank you everyone for tuning in tonight. It's wonderful to have such a strong audience, and we'll see you in 2 weeks' time to hear about birds which are struggling a lot, the Boerte's larks here in South Africa. So we've got the Boerte's lark task team presenting to us on their plight. So we'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks, everyone. Good night.